president of the Women Law Students Association. On behalf of WILSA, we would like to thank everyone for coming out today to hear our speaker. WILSA is one of the largest student organizations at the law school, and their mission is to strengthen women by providing educational, professional, and social events that benefit all students, but with a particular focus on women in the law. Some of the past events of WILSA have included Habitat for Humanity, Prevent Child Abuse Athens, exam and curriculum workshops for first-year law students, and participation in the GAWL art auction. However, the high point of WILSA's year is today the Edith House Lecture. And at this time, I would like to introduce Candace Barrett, who is one of the coordinators of today's event.
Hi, my name is Candace Barrett, and it has been my pleasure to chair this year's Edith House Lecture Committee. I would like to join Erica in welcoming you to the 27th Annual Edith House Lecture. I would also like to introduce to you Edith House, for whom this lecture series is named. Edith House was born and raised in Winder, Georgia. Miss House decided she wanted to become a lawyer when she was 13 years old, after hearing that the General Assembly had passed a bill allowing women to practice law. In 1922, Miss House's desire to become a lawyer became a reality when she entered the University of Georgia School of Law, being only one of two women in the class. 3 years later, Miss House graduated co-valedictorian of the first law class to graduate women. She accepted a job in private practice in Florida, only to become an assistant U.S. attorney 4 years later. Over the next 34 years, she's dedicated her life to law and worked to reorganize the Southern District of Florida before retiring from the U.S. Attorney's Office in 1963. To honor her achievements and success, the Women Law Students Association created not only this lecture series, but we also commissioned a portrait of Miss House that hangs in the law school. Despite achieving what many women in her generation did not and perhaps could not even dream of doing, Miss House did not let the magnitude of her accomplishments affect her. In an article that was written about the time that a portrait was unveiled over the law school, she said, "I never had figured I'd accomplish anything extraordinary, except I stayed off welfare and I stayed out of jail." Just the fact that I was a woman and practiced law at the time made a big splash, but I don't see why everyone should get so excited about that. Despite her modesty, the Women Law Students Association is proud to honor Edith House as an example of great achievement for women in the law. Since 1983, we have invited outstanding female attorneys to speak to us about a variety of topics in the law. The success and long life of this lecture series is sustained by generous contributions to the Edith House Lecture Fund and the continued support of the University of Georgia's faculty and staff. For this support, we are incredibly grateful. At this time, I would like to introduce Associate Professor of Law, Lori Wincan. Professor Wincan teaches constitutional law, election law, and state and local government. Her research focuses on empirical work regarding the voting patterns and practices of U.S. Supreme Court justices. Professor Wincan earned her undergraduate degree from the University of Wisconsin and her JD from the University of Wisconsin Law School, where she served as a Wisconsin law review. Additionally, she attained a BCL distinction in European Comparative Law from the University of Oxford. The Women Law Students Association sincerely appreciates her being with us today. Please make welcome Professor Lloyd.
Thank you, Candace. It's my pleasure to introduce for you today on this much nicer day than I'm supposed to be here. Our speaker, Professor Felice J. Professor Batlan is a professor of law at the Chicago-Kent College of Law. She previously was a professor of law in women's studies at Tulane Law School. She's also a summa cum laude graduate of the fabulous Smith College and a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard Law. And if that were not enough, she managed someplace in there to squeeze in a doctorate in history from NYU. Her professional accomplishments are as numerous and varied. She had what must have been just the tremendous and inspirational opportunity to clerk with Judge Constance Baker Motley. She also practiced corporate and securities law in New York and worked as a general counsel and global head of compliance, which I'm not not sure what it means, but it sounds very intimidating, for Greenwich Capital Markets. And she's currently a fellow in legal history at NYU. It's Professor Batlan's academic work, though, that brings her to us today. Her work sits at the intersection of law, gender, and history. And in doing so, it tells us not just what the law has become, but why we think about the law the way we do, and whose interests have and have not been considered and incorporated in the process of the development of the law. And she's going to talk to us today about that process of incorporation and change. In her talk, Are We Our Mothers Law Students? Women's Law School Experiences and an Agenda for Action. Please join me in welcoming Professor Felice J.
Thank you, Professor Ringham, for that wonderful, wonderful introduction, and certainly to Walsa and Candace, who makes midnight runs to the airport. I very much appreciate your inviting me for this lecture, and I actually consider it to be an enormous honor. And I'd hope that Edith House would have approved of this talk, as it is in fact about women's experiences in law school. And we really have to understand that women in large numbers in law school is a very recent phenomenon. It occurred in the 1970s, primarily as a result of the women's liberation movement. Although women had been attending law school since the 1870s, in fact, as I argue elsewhere, essentially practicing law since the 1850s, their numbers were in fact minuscule, and I mean absolutely minuscule. And part of this was institutional, of course. Law schools did not admit women, and bars did not admit women. So we all know of Myra Bradwell, who was refused admission to the Illinois bar, and when she challenged this in the Supreme Court in 1873, they ruled that she had no constitutional protection from such discrimination under the 14th Amendment. Likewise, multiple women, really asserting their agency, sued to be admitted to law schools, to be admitted to the bar, and they in fact usually lost their cases. But in general, when we think about how law schools slowly opened up to women through the 20th century, there are a couple of things that are worth mentioning. And one is that the more prestigious the law school, the less likely they were to admit women. So Harvard did not admit women until 1950, right? That's really quite amazing. And even into the 20th century, when women were admitted to law school, they often found themselves to be the sole woman in their class, i.e., Edith House herself. For example, although UNC Chapel Hill admitted women in 1911, by 1926, only 3 women had graduated. So the fact that women now make up 50% of all law students is really remarkable. But my question here today is not one about numbers, so much as it is about the quality of women's law school experiences. And so a little background to the study that I'm going to be talking about today. In the spring of 2007, as part of my gender and the law class at Chicago Kent, we read portions of Lonnie Guinet's Becoming Gentlemen, Women, Law Schools, and Institutional Change, as well as some more recent studies about women law students' experiences. And Lonnie Guinet in 1994 explored the experiences of women law students at the University of Pennsylvania. And the study, which was really absolutely groundbreaking, found significant academic differences between men and women. And although men and women entered law school with practically identical academic qualifications, men received better grades in law schools, were on law review, and often got better jobs than women. Additionally, the study found strong differences between men and women, such as men participating more in class and certainly getting more faculty attention. Furthermore, women in these very, very poignant anecdotes describe significant, and I'm going to bracket this for a moment, psychological problems, or I want to say problems, stemming from law school and how they were treated by both faculty and other law students. And the book generated very strong reactions from my students. In part, I had thought that they may not actually relate to the experiences of these women from 1994. This was a new age, a new dawn. But of the 22 women in my class, about 3/4 of them deeply related to the sense of alienation experienced by the women in Gwenet's study. Many of the students expressed the sentiment that they wished they'd read the article earlier in their law school careers, as they had assumed that their own feelings of depression, sinking confidence, were individual problems. And importantly, Gwenet blamed women's law school problems on the law school as an institution rather than on personal pathologies. Yet about 1/3 of my class felt that they had not experienced discrimination in law school, they did not feel alienated, they did not have sinking confidence, and that the dissatisfaction that women law students expressed were really part of all law students' experiences, men and women, and something that you sort of got over. So we sort of had this discussion, and we wondered what would happen if we conducted our own survey of our own community at Chicago-Kent, and what would we find? And we were especially interested because Chicago-Kent was one of those institutions that had started admitting women in the 1890s. And there are a number of things at Chicago-Kent, such as some smaller classes, a large number of female instructors, not professors, and ongoing student feedback that they received. And so we thought, well, students here at Kent, we're not going to find probably the same results as Gwenet found. And so 4 of my students and I decided to conduct a survey of law students and its experiences in law school and the correlation to gender. And as we did so, a number of issues and insights emerged. We wondered how we could actually employ a feminist methodology in conducting our work, and how our survey might be animated by what I'm calling third wave feminism. So what is third wave feminism? So according to the literature, it's on its most basic level generational, referring to people who essentially came of age in the 1980s to the present. So it refers to women who were born too late to participate in the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s, and that is generally called second wave feminism. And by way of note, first wave feminism refers to the period between 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention, and 1920, when women gained the vote. So third wave feminists are the beneficiaries of the incomplete inroads of second wave feminism and its attempt to dismantle patriarchy. In other words, and I say this, I think, to most of us in this room, we, as third wave feminists, came to age in a world in which du jour gender equality was close to being realized, even though de facto equality may still remain elusive. And so here I want to talk a little bit about third wave feminism. So when you read third wave feminism, a lot of it is highly autobiographical. A lot of it also is about culture. So they're very interested in issues of media, the portrayal of women in television, in movies, and they embrace sex in its multitude of forms. They're also always questioning boundaries and borders and definitions. And autobiography is really one of the prime ways in which third wave feminists, at least, publish. And so autobiography was actually pretty important to us. And as feminist legal theorists know, autobiography is especially important in writing about law. For the personal can disrupt the law's claim to neutrality and correct for conventional legal discourse, which erases a situated and gendered individual. Personal narratives can also emphasize how an author is multiply situated and challenges legal argumentation that privileges objective knowledge. And by no means here am I saying there's no such thing as objective knowledge, but it challenges that question. At the same time, autobiography can be limiting, which made us wonder really why third-wave feminists used autobiography so much. And I think this is because of the fear of essentializing women. And that is imagining that all women are the same, or all men are the same, and failing to take into account race, class, sexual orientation, and a myriad of other characteristics. The other problem is if taken to an extreme, anti-essentialism, however, and this is one of the prime criticisms of much of feminism, demands that we speak for nobody but ourselves. So we found ourselves in this dilemma in which we wanted to conduct a survey of women's law experience, law school experiences, at the same time questioning whether there even is a category of women, right? And why should we be using gender rather than something else such as class? And so while we were creating our survey, we actually tried to bring in all the issues of class, sexual orientation, family background, family relationships, political affiliations, and religions. We also were deeply interested in questions of masculinity, so that we weren't just looking at how women law students thought of themselves, but also how male law students thought of themselves, and what that meant, as well as the relationships between women law students and male law students. And so with these concerns in mind, especially concerns about anti-essentialism, we began sort of trying to create our study. In doing this, between September 2007 and May 2008, our group met weekly, usually for 2 to 3 hours, and all of our decisions were made collectively and by consensus, which meant that I really had to step back, and I didn't play the role of law professor, but rather I was simply another in a research cohort. We also decided that our most important goals was to actually create knowledge that could be put into action. So we didn't want to just study for the sake of studying. We really wanted to come up with an agenda in terms of whatever our results told us. So let me talk to you a little about the literature that was out there before we did our study. There were 19 studies of women's experiences in law school, spanning from 1987 to 2006. Generally, such works concluded that women are much less satisfied with their law school experiences than men, and often experience deep feelings of alienation while in law school. Equally alarming was that some schools had put in changes to essentially ease the gender gap, but that actually had little effect on women's dissatisfaction. So here's a few examples. A study of grades earned by first-year law students at elite schools such as Yale and Stanford found that as a group, women get better grades than men as undergraduates, worse grades than men in law school. A University of Texas Law School study found that having a high percentage of women in the law school class did not actually overall affect women's academic performance. Rather, all success indicators, GPA, top 10%, order of the Coy, Law Review, showed significant gender performance gaps. A very recent Harvard study similarly showed these gaps. From 1997 to 2003, and these statistics are amazing, male graduates at Harvard were 70 times more likely than females to receive magna cum laude or better. In a sample of first-year grades, 31% of men received an A- or better, compared to 15% of women. So, right, still huge gaps. Other things that studies have found is that women do not participate in class to the same extent as men. At Harvard, men spoke 50% more than women in class. A study of Bolt Hall, Berkeley, revealed that a majority of women and people of color never volunteered in class. And here the authors hypothesized that such silence reflects a conscious decision by women not to conform to law school's narrow analytical perspective. In addition, almost twice as many women as men believed that the sex of the professor made a difference in the frequency that they were called upon in class. Further, 70.8% of female students and 55.4% of male students believed that women professors were more encouraging. So you not only had problems like this, but there's also been a number of studies of sexual harassment in law school. In a study of Ohio schools, close to 20% of women self-reported that they had been subjected to sexual harassment while in law school. Legal scholar Morrison Torrey writes that statistics leave little doubt that sexual harassment in legal education is rampant, and she continues that being the victim of sexual harassment results in the loss of confidence, causes anxiety, and a host of other emotional and physical symptoms that severely impact the victim's abilities to succeed in law school. So that's all the right negative stuff. And so you look at that and you think, gosh, this is awful. So now let me give you some of the more positive stuff. As law schools actually took heed to some of these studies, they began to implement various recommendations regarding creating a more woman-friendly environment. And generally, this included smaller class size, greater feedback, and an increase in female faculty members. And some of these schools track the efforts of such reform. So also interestingly, when you see which schools did what, again, Ivy Leagues are not in the category for implementing any changes. So studies conducted at Chapman, Brooklyn, and Wisconsin law schools revealed that new curricular and pedagogies decreased academic disparities among men and women students. But they do not actually erase overall dissatisfaction by women with their law school experiences. So for example, Brooklyn increased its number of female faculty members and restructured its first-year curriculum. And a subsequent study found that Brooklyn's academic performance was comparable, that women's academic performance was comparable to that of men. Yet female students still reported significantly higher rates of anxiety, depression, crying, sleeping difficulties during their law school career. And researchers concluded that what goes on in the classroom is actually crucial to how women law students feel about themselves. And not only do these changes actually make women more comfortable, and I want to say to some extent in law school, but these studies also have found that male law students, when these changes are implemented, are actually happier in law school as well. So let me talk about our study. Once we created our study, the next task was administering it. And we wanted, obviously, to obtain the largest and most representative samples of responses. And what we decided to use was an anonymous internet-based survey, which could also cut, slice, and tabulate results in quite remarkable ways. And we were very fortunate in that a multitude of student organizations, WALSA, keep on going. I would say most of the student organizations, as well as the faculty and deans, were willing to send emails to students with an electronic link to our survey. So in a really true third wave fashion, we made use of cyberspace and also sought to include our entire community. And we received 446 responses, which represented essentially half of the student body, which is actually amazing. We were told, sort of part of this process is we all had to learn a little bit about statistics and about giving surveys. And over we were told by experts to expect a 10 to 20% return. So a 50% return said students were actually interested in talking to us about what their experiences were and really welcomed the opportunity to communicate. So before we tabulated our results, we looked at some of our school statistics and found some really shocking things. Everybody expected that GPAs for men and women at Kent were going to be similar, and that women were probably doing better in terms of their grades than men. Faculty took bets on this in our faculty lounge. Shockingly, what we found instead was that for the past 5 years, women actually had slightly lower GPAs than men. So nobody in the school even knew this. At the same time, a review of law review membership, as well as moot court, indicated that women were actually overrepresented. So, which means that there's some group of women who are performing extremely highly, whereas sort of the bulk, there was this GPA difference. We also asked for our students to self-report their class participation. And men had higher rates of self-reported daily class participation. In fact, 24% of men volunteered versus 16% of women on a daily basis. And men and women differ greatly in their reasons for not participating. So this is their language, not my language. So women were more likely than men to report that they were silent in class due to timidity or fear. So women didn't speak because they were intimidated or they were fearful of speaking. Well, men were more likely to report that they didn't participate because they were unprepared or had a lack of interest. Interestingly, a much greater number of men indicated that they participated in, a much greater number of women indicated that they participated in class more during their second and third year. And in fact, a greater number of men indicated that they participated less in their second and third year. And so this was a puzzle for us to try to figure out. And we thought this may indicate that men actually began to self-censor, while women became more comfortable participating in the smaller classes offered to second and third year students. And it may also demonstrate that second and third year men became more relaxed and no longer felt that they had to prove themselves constantly and aggressively. Questions regarding the Socratic method also brought out large differences. Men were much more likely to be, quote, extremely comfortable with the Socratic method, and women were much more likely not to be at all comfortable with the Socratic method. And ironically, in informal conversations that we had with female students, when given the opportunity to address some of their silences in class, they actually had a ton to say about it. One issue raised was whether women under-participate, and I think this is important, or men actually over-participate. So some women were like, we don't under-participate. We come in when it's, we feel like we have something to say, and it's these men who keep chatting. And so they were saying, we don't want to be measured in that way. And women expressed the common sentiment that they only spoke in class when they actually felt their comments would add to the discussion. Men, some of these women believed, and this is their perception, so I'm not saying this is true, but men, some of them believe, often made comments that were not on point and did not enhance class conversation. And one woman stated that during her first year, there were about 10 gunners in her class, 9 who were men. And although she found such students annoying, she actually began to believe that she was an inferior law student because she chose to listen rather than speak. And she explained this as a personal learning style, but that also she was very concerned about interrupting the flow of class. So sort of this concern for her fellow students. Other students indicated that when they were called upon by a professor, anxiety caused them to freeze, and even though they knew the answer. And this was something we heard over and over again for women. I knew the answer, but I just couldn't raise my hand, or I was called upon and I knew the answer and it didn't come out right. Other women commented that they thought that speaking in class could potentially be very embarrassing, and that prevented them from speaking. Related to the frequency of class participation is whether the speakers feel that their audience is in fact listening. And not surprisingly, men were much more likely than women to believe that the audience was receptive when they spoke. We also tried to examine interactions with professors outside of class. And these interactions, I think, both as a professor as well as a student, are really crucial. Because they're a time not only to ask substantive questions of professors, but to build relationships with them, which in a very material way can lead to letters of recommendation, career opportunities, mentorships, research assistance. And all the studies showed that men interacted with their professors a great deal more than women did. We actually didn't find that. We found that they actually interacted, men and women, on an equal basis, but reported very different feelings when doing so. So most women reported they felt somewhat comfortable approaching professors, while men felt, quote, comfortable. And in informal conversations, a lot of women admitted to feeling intimidated when approaching their professors, whom had some characterized as disinterested in talking to students, or who a lot of them said, they're too busy to actually talk to us. We don't want to bother them. And a number of women felt that when they went to a professor's office, they needed to come with a list of prepared questions in order not to waste the professor's time. None of the men responded in that way. When we spoke to men, they said, of course, we're entitled to, we pay money to come to this school, and we're entitled to go speak to professors. And they didn't have that same concern with somehow disrupting the professor's time. And so I think that's a really crucial attitudinal difference, which we as faculty need to actually correct for. So here I want to turn to issues of confidence and self-perception. Almost all studies indicate that women law students have less confidence than male law students, and our results were no exception. Men were slightly more likely than women to report that they felt very well prepared for law school prior to beginning law school. However, there were much larger discrepancies between men and women regarding how they felt about their intelligence since entering law school. A much larger percentage of women, 30.7% than men, 17%, indicated they felt less intelligent now than they did prior to attending law school. Which, right, that's pretty amazing as a faculty member, I think. How can I make somebody feel less smart than they felt before they came into my class? And if 30.7% of women are reporting that, there's something we're doing that's not right. Men, likewise, were more likely than women to feel more intelligent than they did prior to attending law school. Men were also much more likely than women to report that they always felt as academically qualified as other law students in their class. And while men and women expressed that in equal numbers that law school had met their expectation, women were much more likely to indicate that they were less pleased than expected with law school. So, right, I think that is a crucial puzzle for us to figure out, and in a way that doesn't enshrine men as sort of the neutral yardstick to say, well, we should all feel like these very confident men do in class, but we need to create a way in which people don't feel less intelligent or truly dislike their law school experiences. Women were also more likely to report finding gender issues in the classroom. And many more women reported than men that a professor had used a hypothetical that portrayed women in a sexually demeaning manner or portrayed women as a group in a harmful manner. And some of the anecdotes that we got from students were really poignant anecdotes about how various comments had made them feel. And again, as a faculty member, and knowing the professors that many of these students were talking about, these professors weren't doing it on purpose, right? They didn't harbor, meanness and, want to make their students feel uncomfortable. They didn't realize that it was doing that. So here are just a couple of other statistics. While men and women reported in equal percentages that Kent was a comfortable environment for a man, results were extremely different when women were asked whether they thought that Kent was a comfortable environment for a woman. 42% of men strongly agreed that it was a comfortable environment for a woman, whereas only 27% of women felt that way. And so on one basis you can say, okay, well, men just don't get it. But actually, I was really interested in the men who, the 38% of men, who actually did understand that the environment may not be comfortable for a woman. And I think that actually shows some tremendous sensitivity. In terms of sexual harassment, our numbers, I can proudly say, I think were quite amazing. Although nobody should be sexually harassed, only 3% of students reported sexual harassment in the law school. Tremendous improvement from earlier studies. We really also wanted to understand race. And there, on our survey question, there were a lot of questions in connection with race. And we got some really fascinating results. One was that whereas Caucasian students did not see discrimination in the way that either minority faculty members or students were treated, many African Americans did see that. So there was a complete disconnect there. In addition, we found strong differences in responses from African American men and African American women. A much larger percentage of male African American respondents, 60%, reported that they felt more intelligent than they did prior to attending law school. In contrast, only 16% of African American women reported that. And some of the comments that African American women wrote were some of the most poignant comments in terms of how they thought they were being viewed by both professors and other law students. In terms of, they felt that they were often being thought of as the cleaning staff rather than law students, and that was the way that they were perceived, and people would make these mistakes. And so that was really very, very poignant. We didn't actually, our sample size for African American students wasn't great, and one of our projects in the future is to, in fact, try to go back and do a multi-school survey of African American as well as Latina and Latinos in the future. So when we wrote up the results of our study, we thought that our most gratifying work had already been completed. You know, this was our survey, here are our results. And we, in fact, couldn't have been more wrong. In April 2008, so just about a year ago, we presented our study to a series of student groups and to the faculty and administration. And we had numerous different meetings with students, and so that they could come during lunch hours, they could come during dinner. We were really nervous about what students would think. And we feared presenting the faculty with a talk that was at times critical. Also, we were really worried about speaking about women and gender, because when the students took the survey, they just understood it as a law student experience study. We didn't say gender because that would have skewed our results. So we thought, oh gosh, people are going to be furious that when they find out that this was about women. And in fact, we couldn't have been more wrong. All of our presentations were extremely well attended, and the students, both men and women, deeply related to the experience of the law students that we describe. Also, many learned for the very first time that there were these studies out there, and that much of what they were feeling, or some of what they were feeling about law school, was not somehow an isolated feeling, but rather much of the group felt that way. After each presentation, we had discussion sessions and asked the students for recommendations about what the law school community might do. And I'll just tell you one personal experience that for me was an extraordinary learning experience. And that's that one student showed up, a white male, who sat in the second row and with his baseball cap on and, you know, real low and, you know, sort of body expression like, do I really have to listen to this? And I thought, oh gosh, he's going to be the one who stands up and starts screaming that we've wasted everybody's time doing this survey and that this is useless. And he didn't say anything at all, and I thought, okay, well, we've alienated one person. And he later showed up in my office and said, thanks so much for doing this, because, you know, I've always felt that women weren't being treated exactly the same way in classes. And my mom was a feminist, and like there's these pictures of her like marching with signs. And I'm actually amazed that you're even thinking about this. And I teach corporate law as well as women in the law. And he said, I just knew you taught corporate law. I had no idea. And you did this gender stuff. This is just great. And I said, and we had this wonderful talk. And I said, well, why didn't you say anything at our meeting? And he said, because this was a meeting finally where women should have the right and the ability to speak. And I didn't want my voice to interfere with that. You know, so there were like these moments of this incredible communication that were generated from our survey. We also presented the survey to faculty and administration. And I was amazed. It was extremely well attended, and many had actually read the study. And in stark contrast to the resistance that I feared, many faculty, like students, were actually completely unaware of the multitude of studies that described students' gendered experiences at law school. And I'll say there, before going into that meeting, my students, we all did it together, we did all of our presentations together, were terrified because they were now confronting, right, some of these professors who they had had real problems with. And I, as an untenured faculty member, thought, I must be insane to do this. And again, completely different. Discussion actually legitimately focused on whether what we described were women's law school experiences or really experienced to some extent by all law schools, and women were simply able to better express their emotions. We talked about the Socratic method, and whether we should be using the Socratic method, and what our duties were as a law school to prepare students for the real world and what real world really meant. And this was a fascinating conversation because you had faculty saying, well, the real world is tough and lawyers need to be really aggressive when they're out there, and you know, we need to do that for our students, and we can't coddle them and hug them and make them feel good. And other faculty said, well, no, in fact, you know, one of the things lawyers do is counsel their clients and work to resolve disputes. And there's many ways in which a lawyer might act. And so we can't assume that the real world is this model of sort of combative male litigation. I think it's fair to say that some on the faculty were energized by the survey and really committed themselves to address the issue. One faculty member, an older white man who really had not thought at all about gender, probably ever, was really horrified by our results. And he actually devoted one of his classes to discussing the role of gender in law school, in that he wanted to hear from his actual students. And other faculty began to share their own experience of law school with their students. Following our presentation, we met with senior administration and faculty to brainstorm about reforms. By fall 2008, we'd worked on multiple initiatives. We've instituted a first-year orientation program on diversity, in which a very diverse group of student leaders discussed their own first-year experiences and the strategies that they employed for coping with law school. We also set up a mentoring program in which faculty volunteered to mentor students, and students opted in to having a faculty advisor. Over 60% of the faculty volunteered, and over 85% of our law students opted into the program, and we now have a very, very strong faculty advising system. Students working with the administration are also, and this is not something I've talked about here very much, are also in the process of creating a parenting community. So one of the things we found in our survey, which nobody had ever known, was that 20% of our students are parents, which is a shocking number for us all. We had no idea. And so things that parents need, such as childcare, such as actual parenting groups, we're in the process of creating. And finally, we're collaborating with our Women in Law Society to both have faculty advisors and to make it a stronger organization. Other recommendations, which have not been implemented yet, include hiring more women. We found that only half of our students had a female professor in their first year, and trying to create an environment in which students created their own support groups on campus. And as it seems here, through the society, it seems that you have a fabulous women's law society here that probably has eased many of you into law school. As we've learned from the feminist movement and our own experiences as a research cohort, consciousness raising can in fact be very powerful. In a group of 5, for example, we were empowered by sharing our stories of angst, our stories of victory, and strategies to enhance our own understanding and our own commitment. And soon our stories actually spread into this larger dialogue, one that included the voices of those who completed our survey, read our results, or listened to our presentations. And we actually suggest for those students who are interested is to in fact conduct your own survey. If you go to my website at Kent Law, we've made our study available to anybody who wants it. Take the study, run it formally, run it informally. For something like, $50, you too can have access to SurveyMonkey, right, which does all the tabulation for you. Finally, I'm actually now working with a new group of students to generate material about women in law schools that can be given to all first-year students. We're also working on a website that will have resources for law students, a large number of resources for law students, however they are situated. And we're working on a law school-wide project in which all students can write and post narratives about their own law school experiences. It remains to be seen whether these initiatives will have any impact and whether the momentum that the study generated can in fact be sustained. But for now, I thank you for listening to me, and I am actually very interested in hearing your comments and your suggestions. So thank you. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tina. First, I just wanted to thank you for coming. That was really a wonderful presentation, and I think it was really enlightening for all of us. And I can definitely say, at least personally, I think I could have related to a lot of the stuff that you said. But I'm just curious to know what you think as far as how much of these experiences are a result of what's going on in law school or a result of society as a whole, these external factors as far as how we perceive ourselves as women, as getting a graduate degree, all of that. What is that relationship?
I think that's a really great question, and I think the two obviously cannot be separated. And it's not just, law school that's doing it. So I want to respond 2 ways, and that's like a question I often get. And one is, if it wasn't law school, you'd expect to see similar results for women undergraduates. Yet we don't see similar results for women as undergraduates. In fact, women have generally often higher grades. The average grade for a woman in an undergraduate is actually higher than a man's grade. And women's experiences are often extremely positive as undergraduates. So something happens between undergraduate and law school, right? That's only 4 summer months that makes that difference. And so certainly there's a larger issue of how women are acculturated, both to be sensitive to others' needs, right? Maybe not to speak as much, to be more concerned about giving rather than receiving. But law school, I think, in particular, doesn't value those characteristics. And so I do think that there's something particular about professional schools and what goes on in professional schools. I don't think that law schools, by implementing various changes, are going to get rid of this problem, right? Because some of this is absolutely the result of how women are acculturated and what we may say, often a very devastating culture and what that culture does to women. But what we know is it can get better.
Just to follow up on that, have there been any studies? I mean, I can see why there's a huge difference between undergrad and graduate school, not even maybe professional school, just because I think as a society we've gotten more accustomed to seeing women with a graduate degree, maybe not so much with a postgraduate degree, but have there been any studies with like med school? What is their experience with women there versus in law school to really see if it's factors, that is it part of the Socratic method? Is it part of something here, or is it just professional schools or grad schools?
You don't see the same results of women in med schools. Med school students are really unhappy, by the way. If you think like law school students are unhappy, be a medical school student. But you don't see the same gender gap in med school as you actually do in law school. And so med school doesn't provide the analogy. There's lots of other graduate schools. In fact, PhD programs, many PhD programs right now, especially outside of the sciences, are predominantly women compose those programs. So you don't see that in PhD programs. You don't see that in journalism school. Business schools have not done the gender studies. So we don't really have the literature there. Yes?
I have a question. So medical students are also very unhappy, which I totally believe. Do you think it's the nature of the field? Like, okay, medical is can be very nurturing, and it can be more towards what we think of as what women should do. Even though, of course, men were, predominantly physicians and so recently. But whereas law is so, a lot of people describe it as being so adversarial, and the law school curriculum developed from the practice of law. Is it something that can't be fixed because of the nature of the program?
Okay, so I think that the nature of the profession is actually important, and what we imagine to be that nature of the profession. So I don't actually believe that the practice of law, and I practiced law for 9 years, is necessarily combative. In fact, my job was to get everybody to come to consensus, right, internationally and sign on. I worked with regulators, international regulators from literally across the globe, and we had to come to consensus about what the rules and practices were going to be. The last thing I ever needed or wanted to be was confrontational, right, on these issues. And so our vision of what the practice of law is I think both sort of old-fashioned and is based upon the male lawyer, right, the Joseph Flums of the world, which has never actually been the case. And so there's not that relationship. The other thing is that whereas the medical profession was open to women very early. So from the 1840s on, women were going to medical school, often medical schools for women. And it sort of makes sense because there was this idea that medical care is very intimate. And in a Victorian morality, right, a male doctor should not be so intimate with a female patient, and that a woman doctor would better understand the problems of women. And so there's a much longer history of women in medicine than women in law. The other thing is the Socratic method. And all of that was really created in the 1880s, the 1890s. It's a relatively new creation, which had to do with the material practices and the economics of law school, right? So the Socratic method is a way in which you can have 100 students in your class all paying tuition, right? And they do learn, right? They can actually learn rather than having much smaller classes as that law school actually developed and having sort of conversation and dialogue. And so there's a very material element about how we teach law. And so that's not natural. It's completely constructed. Yeah?
Yeah, I would say, my name is Allison, and
I know. We met.
As a practical matter, because of these things like the Socratic method, diversity training, while probably very necessary and a good idea, without changing the fundamental structure of law school, how far will that really get us to erasing, without changing the Socratic method, number of female teachers, raising awareness, how far will that really get us?
Okay. So that's a great question. So I know that there are practical limitations. And there's no way we're going to say, okay, all of our classes are going to be, 20 students. And of course, professors would love that too if all of our students, all of our classes could be 20 students. That's not happening. But at a minimum, what we can do, and it costs no money, is at least talk to each other, right? So if women, and not just women, but if women and men law students actually talk about what they're experiencing and how they're feeling about it, at least they know they're not going insane, right? That everybody else is feeling that way too, that they're not the only person who feels stupid. They're not the only person who thinks that the school made a mistake in sending them the acceptance letter, right? They're not the only student who didn't get A's, who used to be an A student and is now a B student or is a B minus student. And so the competition amongst law students themselves, I think, often prevents that interaction. And so I think law students have a role in getting beyond that competition and having these conversations. I mean, on the most basic level, everyone can be polite to each other when somebody else is speaking in the classroom, right? And if they bring up a point from a different perspective, not to laugh, right? And so I'm not being Pollyannish here, right? There's massive changes that would be wonderful if those could take place. I'm under no illusion that that's going to happen. But we can work on at least the daily problems. Yes?
Liz, if I can take it. After those 19 studies were done, before your study was done, did anybody follow up and see how these experiences for women translated into real law practice 5 or 10 years down the road?
No. I mean, and it's a great project. And so there's this gap. So we have all these gender studies about law school, and then we have all these studies about women in the legal profession. And all of those are somewhat depressing about women in the legal profession. We know that. What the correlation is, we don't know. And of course, it's not that women don't do well in the legal profession. It's that women leave the legal profession. And, a host of issues are involved with that. But that correlation, there's nothing there.
I totally believe things, and I'll try real quick. I read an article that was, I can't remember who wrote it, for I think CBS News a few years ago, that as certain professions become less desirable, men move out, and hence that's why women are moving in, not necessarily because feminism is so successful.
Totally, I think that's totally right.
Medicine.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. As women, as certain professions become less prestigious, whether it be medicine, whether it be law, then those professions open up to women. So I think in fact, we're seeing that to a large extent in the 80s and the 90s in connection with law, because men were going into investment banking, right? Investment banking was predominantly, hugely male, especially sales, trading, where some of the real huge money was, right? And so that law was in fact becoming more and more feminized. So I think that's accurate.
And the other thing with medical school, isn't it more that the women that go into medical school, many of them take on more of a male persona to survive medical school than retaining their feminine sides, except for maybe OBGYN people or something like that? I mean, it's vastly competitive too, especially in the surgical areas.
So I don't want to say they take on a male persona. So my analysis of gender is that gender, of course, is not biological, it's a social construct, and we perform gender constantly. And sort of some of this gender studies on law school like to say, well, part of the problem is that women are being forced to essentially perform maleness, right? But I don't think there's anything that is so innate in that. So does that in fact make them perform, right, becoming gentlemen? Lonnie Guinet's work was all about that. Are they in fact becoming gentlemen? I have a much more amorphous concept of gender, and one that allows for constant sort of change in that performance. And what constitutes, right, we could easily say in clinical, right, men are being forced to perform being women, right, especially in poverty law, being deeply caring, being patient, right, learning to listen, So I think there's a lot of ways that that can actually be played with.
Thank you.
And I will say female doctors are much more likely to become family practitioners and OBGYNs, and especially less and less doctors want to be family practitioners because the money's not there. Surgery remains male. So the more prestigious the subsection, the more men there are.
In your review of the literature about sort of this process, I'm having a hard time visualizing the process. Were there models of institutional change that you thought this could accomplish? I mean, are there models you can point to kind of reach that middle ground before things start changing?
In terms of what a law school would look like?
In terms of how that change would occur within the law school environment, when you have these competing forces of what you alluded to, that kind of male-dominated structure, and then avoiding women sort of acquiescing to that culture to find that sort of middle ground.
I think I can answer that no. I mean, you know, schools have instituted changes. I mean, they've gotten rid of, in many ways, that academic performance gap, which I think is crucial, right? So all of it's very, very important, but that is so fundamental, and we know how to do that. In terms of actually increasing satisfaction, I don't know, right? It's all experimental, and it's all innovation in many ways. Many of the studies that we discuss were, in fact, done by students, especially the earlier surveys, and one of the problems with students is they graduate. And so you didn't have the continuity. Also, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there are some tremendous differences. When the Harvard study was done about 2 years ago, they did not have the support of the administration or the faculty, and there was a lot of hostility to even conducting the survey. In contrast, we had the complete support of our administration and of our faculty. I mean, so there are variances and differences. How you actually create that on-the-ground change, I haven't seen it happen. I mean, it's a slow process. But before change can happen, you've got to be talking about change.
Well, that reflects on this law. I mean, you know, kind of the methodology. So it makes sense that it would grow up organically. I'm curious about the
Yeah.
social movements and what kind of lessons it might have.
And I think, yes.
I was wondering if you said you found any differences in experiences among age, and particularly did non-traditional women students maybe have more positive experience?
Yes, we did look at age, and a lot of our women students who were parents were also older. What we found is that those women actually did academically very well in law school, but had a lot of dissatisfaction. And part of their dissatisfaction stemmed from their feeling that they couldn't discuss this whole other part of their life, and so that they couldn't let their fellow students know that they were mothers and that they were in fact worried about not having the babysitter. And they didn't feel comfortable saying to the professor, you know, I'm not prepared today because I was up all night because my, you know, baby was vomiting and I was in the emergency room. And so they felt that they had to hide to be taken seriously. They had to hide that whole part of their persona. And so their satisfaction with law school was actually not that high. Although there was a strange number in that by far they were the largest number of people who said, I wouldn't have, this was the right decision. And so they were not happy, you know, with parts of law school. They did well, but they were not happy. But they were very happy they had attended law school. And I think part of that is that it gave them boosted them, you know, to be professionals. The other really interesting thing that we found that I still think about a lot is we asked questions regarding relationships and how your relationships affected law school. And we especially expected married women to say that their relationships affected their studies negatively in terms of they had a whole set of household responsibilities that they also had to do. We found the opposite result. Men felt that their relationships were affected, their relationships affected their ability to succeed in law school negatively, and women felt the other way. And over again, and again, this represents change. Women said, my husband is so supportive of my doing this, and they've taken over a lot of the household experiences. You know, so he does the laundry now, he does all the cooking now. And I thought that was fascinating. Like, I don't think you would have seen that 25 years ago. Likewise, men felt that their relationships negatively affected their ability to succeed because, in fact, they were still expected to provide emotional support, to, quote, be there. Go ahead.
Sorry, my name's Fran. I was wondering, actually, what you were just talking about women who were parents, and they were, they had this dissatisfaction with law school, but they still said that it was the best thing that they had done. Speaking, I guess, bringing the personal aspect to it, yes, I feel like law school kicks me around a whole lot, but there's nowhere else that I would rather be.
Mm-hmm.
How much, in one of the studies you were doing, I don't know if you talked about it, or even, decided to address it, but yes, there's a dissatisfaction in what you're experiencing, but how much does that affect your overall idea of whether you're glad you went and you're prepared to go forward with it from there?
I mean, the question that I think came closest to that was asking whether you were content with your experience or not. We didn't ask the question, are you ultimately happy for your decision? And I think that issue is ultimately resolved, and this goes to the last question, after somebody actually gets into the profession, right? And they look at their life. Interestingly, and this is something I didn't talk about here, we asked an open-ended question at the end, in which we said, talk to us about whatever you want to talk to us about. And we expected, especially since we had asked like so many questions about gender and race, and that people would talk about gender and race. And the only thing well, not the only thing, but by far the majority of students talked about career services and the amount of loans that they had. And, so obviously this weighs upon their minds and then affects the question of, well, did this make sense to go to law school, or didn't it make sense to go to law school? So I think one of the things is that to do a study that actually tracked students for a long period of time would be a great study to do, and to ask that question at multiple points in their careers. Yeah.
And Claire's book, Gentleman, she has a section where she talks about the issue of law school portraits.
Yes.
And how that affected her. And did that come up in your study?
No, because we have really modern art at school.
Okay.
Right. I mean, we have this super modern stuff, so we don't actually have portraits, which I think is great. I mean, when I was at Harvard, looking at all those men, over and over and over again, trying to find a woman's bathroom.
Go walk around the third floor.
I mean, it was frustrating that those portraits send a message about who is a lawyer, who belongs, who doesn't belong. So that was not something that our students actually confront or think about. And I think there was, yes.
My question is, if you, excuse me, do you think there'll be a fourth wave of feminism? If you do, what do you hope that the goal will be at that point?
That's a very great and complicated question. So I'm going to take the assumption and say I actually don't think there are waves. So this sort of periodization of first wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave, I actually think as a historian it's deeply ahistorical, and that there's actually these continuations of issues that previous generations had been dealing with and had addressed. I think there certainly is a difference, right? We're not in the 70s anymore and feminism now, but many of the issues of the feminist movement, not just from the second wave, from the first wave, still remains the issues of feminism. And so I actually don't go for these waves. I think waves are very cute, and are a very easy way of periodizing what is actually happening. I don't believe in waves. I mean, in fact, waves make no sense. From even an experiential point of view. And so my students and I are all third wavers. But my experience, in fact, was much more sort of who my mentors were very much part of the women's liberation movement, and I completely identified with them. And it was really quite funny because two of my students were actually the students of the person who wrote the primer on third wave feminism, and didn't even know there was such a thing as third wave feminism until we read the literature and found out. What I will say is that teaching third wave feminism in gender and law is actually very effective because students can relate a lot to what third wave feminists are writing. It's really sexy stuff. I mean, right, it's sexy. It talks about popular culture. It talks about sex. It talks about sex in the city. And it's a great way of getting them in to thinking about feminism and realizing that they are, in fact, feminists in the first place. So I'm totally like jumping over the real question that you're asking.
Can I follow up?
Sure.
Yeah, this is sort of the question I had before that one. To the extent that, in part it's the language changes and how we talk about things, but there's some tension within the concept of gender as something we perform that is sort of amorphous, and consciousness raising about gender so that we are aware of different sort of purposes of improving the situation. And that can sort of lead to a question of where's the goal. And you see the same tension within different schools of thought with respect to race, and whether we should be, or one should prefer a colorblind approach or an approach which embraces race consciousness and some consciousness of difference.
I think, right, there's been tremendous movement in terms of creating a society which is much less gendered. So our society looks quite different from the 1890s, right? So we're moving away from gender roles which are both, you know, so deeply solidified. At the same time, we don't have equality, and nor do I embrace an equality model, right? The complications with gender is there is difference, right? And what do you do with that difference? So, you know, what the goal is, I think I'll go to Robin West on that, and I think the goal is happiness. So I would say maximizing happiness and creating, right, happiness where you can actually do that on a deeply human level. And so much of that has to do with what gender roles we are forced to perform in terms of creating distances between people, in terms of creating hierarchy. Some hierarchy is good, right? You know, some hierarchy makes sense, but a lot of it doesn't make sense. And comes out of gender. Gender both as performed, gender in a way that is deeply psychological, you know, but I don't have an easy formula. It's like I'm not Nancy Chatterton and saying, okay, as soon as men start nursing, you know, and taking care of infants, we're going to change gender. Right? I don't believe that either. I think, are we at, so thank you very much for giving me